right, so good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms and homes around the world. And I just want to say a special thank you to all our teachers, live families, whether you're live on YouTube, wherever you're coming in from. I know it's a crazy school year for you all, so we really appreciate you taking time out of your days to spend some with us as we highlight amazing people and places. So today we are going back to one of my favorite places to visit on Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, Glacier National Park, one of the most beautiful and unique ecosystems on the planet in beautiful Montana. Again, about a week and a half ago, we covered black bears and grizzly bears in Glacier National Park. Really cool presentations you can check out on our YouTube channel. But today we are going to dive in with the glaciers themselves. So we are joined by Stephanie, who's an educator at the Glacier National Park, and she's going to walk us through their epic landscape. So Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today, and take us away.
Well, hello everyone. I'm super excited to talk to all of you today about one of my favorite topics here at Glacier National Park, are glaciers. But before we get started, I just want to kind of mention the fact that Glacier National Park is one of over 420 different units that are protected by the United States National Park Service. And this organization, the National Park Service, works to protect and preserve a lot of these amazing sites across the United States to keep them around for generations of people to continue to enjoy these spots. So the fact that Glacier National Park was set aside as a national park itself is one of the cool reasons why we can still talk about and see glaciers in this place to this day. And as Jesse had mentioned, Glacier National Park is located in Montana. We're located in very far northwestern Montana. You can actually see that up here with our little red star right there. And our park actually sits right along the Canadian border. We actually have a sister park called Waterton Lakes National Park that goes right into Canada, connected to Glacier, and we are actually the combination of Waterton Lakes and Glacier National Park. We became the world's first international peace park. So just a really other cool kind of bit to this park itself. And all across the glacier, you can see amazing geology, and you can really see kind of clues that tell us about the forces that shaped this land. The picture right behind me here is actually just outside of my office door. It would take me about a minute or two just to walk to the spot. It's our largest lake here in the park. It's called Lake McDonald. It's about 10 miles long and about a mile wide. And this lake itself was actually shaped and carved out by a glacier. So today we're going to be focusing on the impact that these glaciers have had in the park in the past. We're going to learn a little bit about what a glacier exactly is. We're going to see how these glaciers are changing and kind of what are the impacts of these changes. So we're going to get started by first talking about what are glaciers. Essentially, if you break it down to its most basic part, a glacier is just a big sheet of ice. And how a glacier forms is that you get snow collecting on snow, collecting on snow. Over time, when you get enough snow, there's going to be a lot of pressure and a lot of weight pushing down on all those snow crystals. And eventually, that's going to form glacial ice. To keep a glacier around or to keep a glacier growing, you're going to need more snow collecting in the wintertime than melts away in the summer. If you have more snow melting away in the summer than what you get in the winter, you're going to start to see your glaciers start to disappear. So essentially, a glacier is just a big sheet of ice. Here at Glacier, though, we take that definition and we make it a little bit stricter. We actually put a size on our glaciers. So we say that a glacier itself has to be at least 25 acres in size. 25 acres is essentially if you put 25 football fields together. So if anyone likes watching football, imagine a single football field, that's about an acre, put 25 of those together, and you get the minimum size, the smallest size a glacier can be to be considered a glacier here in Glacier National Park. That's still pretty big. We also say they have to be a certain depth. Our depth for a glacier is that it has to be at least 100 feet deep. That would be like taking a semi-truck, turning it on its end, and then stacking another semi-truck on top of that. That's about 100 feet deep. That's pretty deep. And then the last kind of part of that definition is a glacier has to be moving. And when we're talking about a glacier moving, we're not talking about like the speed of a truck or the speed at which you and I walk. We're talking about maybe centimeters or even just a few inches a year. So very slow movement, but it has to be moving because that's kind of how a glacier shapes out a landscape, is by movement. And we're going to be talking a lot about different kind of periods of glaciers we have. Our first kind of period of glaciers that really shaped this landscape were glaciers that were here from about 12,000 years ago to about 2 million years ago. And back when these glaciers formed about 2 million years ago, the North America looked incredibly different than it does today. So you can see that on this map here. Take a look. Everything that you see in white is going to be snow and ice. You can see that a good chunk of Canada is covered in snow and ice. Even a good portion of the northern United States is covered in ice. Maybe some of those states you all are from as well. And then if you look over here at Glacier National Park, we were also covered in snow and ice back at that time. So it was a cooler period in time. It allowed that snow and ice to form. And that snow and ice that formed here 2 million years ago was nothing like we see today. It was really vast amounts of snow and ice. In fact, the glaciers that were here at that time were so thick that you could barely see the tops of the mountains sticking out through those massive sheets of ice. So really huge sheets of ice that were shaping our landscape as they slowly moved over time. And how these glaciers shaped out our landscape had to do with the fact that glaciers are really a big force of erosion. If you've ever heard that word before, erosion, it basically means picking up and moving of sediment. So how glaciers are doing this is they're not just a big sheet of ice. They're actually a sheet of ice that's full of bits and pieces of rock, of sediment, of other materials. So as those glaciers are moving downhill, all of the material of those rocks and things like that in the ice are scraping away at other rocks. And they're kind of pulling other bits and pieces of those mountains and those rocks out and pulling them with it. So that's why when you look at glacier ice, it's not going to look like an ice cube you put in a drink. It's going to look more like this. Basically a sheet of ice covered in rocks and sediment. And as it moves that rock and sediment down slope, it's basically working like erosion, moving that sediment away, putting it somewhere else. And as those glaciers eroded our landscape, they've actually left behind a lot of really cool features in the park that people enjoy to this day. One of what I think is the coolest features that glaciers have contributed to in Glacier National Park is the color of our waterways. If you ever get a chance to come out here, you'll probably notice that a good chunk of our waterways are very blue or green in color, just like this lake behind me here. And why that is because of glaciers. So as I had mentioned, as those glaciers are kind of picking up and moving sediment and pulling that sediment down, as they're moving that sediment, they're kind of breaking it up into really small pieces, bits and pieces of smaller rock. And some of that gets so fine that it actually almost kind of looks like flour when you put it in your hand. We call that rock flour. When that rock flour gets washed into our waterways, it's actually so small that it can't settle to the bottom of our waterways. It actually gets stuck in the water column itself. And then how the sunlight shines on those bits and pieces of rock flour, it bounces back those blues and those greens that we see in our waters. So not only do the glaciers kind of help with the erosion, but they also help contribute to the really beautiful colors that we see here from that rock flour. A few other unique features that we find from those glaciers that were here in the past are things like what I'm standing in right here, kind of this almost semicircle-like structure where the rock wall kind of surrounds the area. There's a lake kind of at the base of that area. Basically, if you were to take your hand, you can mimic this structure as well. So if you take your hand and kind of cup your hand, you will have that kind of rock wall semicircle with your fingers back here, and you'll have that dip in the palm of your hand. You imagine that a single glacier is coming down into the palm of your hand and carving that out. That would be just like what the glacier did here to carve out this feature. And that feature with kind of semicircle shape to it is what we call a cirque, when a single glacier has shaped out the landscape itself. If anyone has been to Glacier National Park before, you may recognize this picture. This is a picture of Avalanche Lake, one of our most popular hikes in the park. Avalanche Lake is sitting right in a cirque. Now, of course, you're going to have more than just one glacier working on a rock at a time. In those instances when you might have two glaciers working on a rock, you're going to form something a little bit different. It's going to be this thin ridge that you see behind me here. It kind of continues across. And if you once again take your hands, we can mimic this. So put your palms together and imagine that you had one glacier carving this side, you had one glacier carving this side. What it leaves behind is just that thin ridge line of your fingers. That thin ridge line carved out by two glaciers is what we call an arête. So arêtes are carved by 2 glaciers, cirques are carved by 1 glacier, and then of course you can have 3 or more glaciers working on a rock. And when that happens, you're going to get something like this, kind of with that pointy top we see way up here, or that triangular top to our mountains. And that is a feature that we call a horn when 3 or more glaciers are working to carve out a mountain. And what I think is so unique about Glacier National Park is you not only find those features, but you also find glacial debris fields. So what in the world is a glacial debris field? Essentially, as glaciers move, they're picking up all of that rock material. Well, eventually they're going to get to a point where they have too much debris in them and they need somewhere to dump some of that debris. So along their path, they'll actually start dumping some of that rock debris. So if you notice in this picture here, you can kind of see these mounds on either side of that glacier. Those are what we call a lateral moraine. So a moraine is basically that debris field. The lateral is telling us it's along the sides of the glacier. So the glacier, as it moves, drops on the sides. But you also have terminal moraines. So terminal moraines are basically where the debris ends, where the glacier, the furthest point it went, it'll dump debris there. So that's the furthest extent of that glacier. And you can see that one right down here. So terminal moraines, lateral moraines can give us a really good idea as to how big glaciers once were here in the park. And no matter where you look in Glacier, you're likely to see one of these glacially carved features. In this picture alone, you can see 4 of those different features we just talked about. The first one is, of course, you can see the rock flower in that blue water of our lake right here. Another thing you might notice if you look around here or kind of curving around the lake area is a nice cirque, that feature that's carved out by a single glacier. You also have this lovely arête kind of surrounding this area up here, that really thin ridge that's carved by those 2 glaciers. And if you look way out into the background, if you notice any of those pointy mountain tops out there, those are going to be those horns carved by 3 or more glaciers. So really all across the park, you can see all of these awesome clues to tell you that these glaciers were here about 12,000 to 2 million years ago. And those glaciers that were here that carved out all those features in our rocks, once they disappeared about 12,000 years ago, we had a period of time in Glacier National Park where we really didn't see glaciers existing. It wasn't until about 6,000 to 7,000 years ago that glaciers started to come back onto our landscape, but they looked a lot different than our original glaciers. The glaciers that came back 6,000 to 7,000 years ago were what we call Alpine glaciers, essentially glaciers that sit way up high in the mountains. And they do sculpt the rock, but on a much smaller scale, so much smaller glaciers. And if you look at this image here, you can actually see where we have marked glaciers across the park. Today we have about 26 glaciers left in Glacier National Park. Anything that you notice kind of in this black font are going to be glaciers that still exist in the park. Anything that you notice in that red font is going to be a glacier that recently, in the last few decades has gotten too small to be considered a glacier anymore. So it's no longer 100 feet deep, no longer 25 acres in size. So the glaciers that meet those requirements, we still have about 26 of those across Glacier. And back in the day, kind of back in our heyday of our glaciers, when we had the most glaciers here, which was 1850, we had about 150 glaciers in the park. That was at the end of the little ice age when things got really cool in the climate. Today with our 26, we can see that a huge amount have disappeared. So we've gone from 150 to 26. Well, how our researchers are able to figure out that we used to have 150 glaciers in the park is they actually will use satellite imagery, and they'll use this imagery to look into the rocks and figure out where they can find moraines. So where they can find glacial debris fields, they're able to figure out, hey, that glacial debris field tells us that's the furthest a glacier has ever gone. So they're able to figure out how big these glaciers used to be and kind of where glaciers used to be located by using that satellite imagery and those glacial moraines to figure out the past and previous sizes of these glaciers. So pretty cool that you can use these features to tell you a little bit more about what the glaciers used to look like. And based on some of those, the satellite imagery, in conjunction with our scientists actually going out and measuring the perimeters of the glaciers across the park, they're going to do this in late spring, early summer, when we have stopped getting snow for the season, but before all of the snow from the winter has started to melt away. They're also going to go and measure it once again at the end of summer. So typically sometime in early September or so that they'll go out and measure once all of the snow has melted away from the prior season. But before we start getting our next winter's snow, they'll measure those two, use those two figures, and then figure out, is the glacier gaining mass or is it losing mass? And what our researchers have figured out since 1850, all of our glaciers have been greatly reduced in size. So some of them may be shrinking at about 9%. They may be 9% of what they used to be. Others have lost about 96% of their ice. In total, on average, our glaciers, we've seen about a 68% reduction in the amount of glacial ice that we see across the park. So a really large chunk of ice has been lost. And a lot of that is due to climate change. While, of course, the climate is naturally changing, warming and cooling, a lot of this is tied to anthropogenic climate change. So basically human-caused climate change. We're just seeing these things really melt out at a much quicker rate than what they typically would and kind of disappear at a much quicker rate. So definitely humans have had a role in kind of accelerating the loss of our glaciers here in the park. And not only is it important for our scientists to measure the size of our glaciers to really figure out if we can still classify them as a glacier, but it's also important for them to study kind of the quality and quantity of the snow and the ice up on our glaciers. So this right here is an image of a scientist who is conducting kind of an analysis on a snow pit. Basically, it's a big pit that you can see like it's dug in the snow. He's going to be taking measurements at different points in the snowpack. And what he's trying to figure out is how much water is in that snow and ice that's up in our mountains. And why that's so important is because a lot of the snow and ice that comes from our glaciers, it goes right into our waterways, our rivers, our lakes. So we want to know how much water are we going to have in our lakes and our rivers across the park in the summertime when all of this melts away. So another really important component of the science when studying a glacier. One other big piece of science that we have here is kind of a really great image to kind of illustrate our loss of our glaciers across the park. And this is a great way for people who aren't in Glacier National Park to even visualize what we're seeing happen. So this is a project that's being done in conjunction with the United States Geologic Survey, or the USGS. They're going out and taking repeat photos of our glaciers. So we have a lot of historic photos of what our glaciers used to look like back in the early 1900s, like you can see right here. And then they're going out trying to find the same exact viewpoint where this was taken. And then they're going and taking an image in that same point to see the differences that we're seeing in these images. So this right here is one of our more popular glaciers in the park, Grinnell Glacier. You can see the image right here from 1910, where that whole image, at least the kind of bottom portion of that image, is completely covered in snow. Well, if you look over here from 2012, so about 100 years later, you can see that a lot of that snow and ice has disappeared. And in fact, so much of it has disappeared that you're just seeing this body of water underneath that ice. So it's really a great way to illustrate that these glaciers are in fact shrinking and are really being heavily impacted by climate change. And they've actually done these repeat photos for most of the glaciers across the park. This right here is a super important glacier for us in the park. It's called Sperry Glacier. It's where a lot of water for the western half of the park originates. And you can notice back in 1913, that snow covered a good chunk of the mountainside. Here in 2008, we have lost a lot of area of that glacier. A lot of that ice has disappeared. So this is a trend that we're seeing across the park. It's a trend that we believe is going to continue into the future. And we do believe in the next few decades or so that a lot of these glaciers, those 26 left, will disappear from our landscape. Whether that be completely disappear or whether it be just get too small under that 25 acres in size to be considered a glacier anymore. But that will have a big impact on the park itself. And one of the biggest impacts we're going to see if these glaciers disappear, and kind of the main reason why they are so important, is the fact that they sit at the tops of our watershed. So here at Glacier National Park, water hitting the park can actually potentially go to 3 different places. So if you notice right here, this little area marked Triple Divide Peak, it is a peak in kind of the southeastern portion of the park. If water, whether it be snow, rain, hits that peak, it can go to 3 different watersheds, depending where it travels. So if it hits there and goes west, it's going to ultimately flow out into the Pacific Ocean. If it hits that peak and continues kind of northeast, it could flow out to the Hudson Bay. If it continues southeast, it's going to go down and continue to the Missouri, Mississippi rivers, and then ultimately out into the Gulf of Mexico. So we really provide water to a lot of different watersheds, a lot of different water bodies. Without all of that water and the snow tied up in those glaciers, melting out every year, a lot of those waterways wouldn't have the water they need. A lot of us wouldn't have the water we need to do the things we do, whether that be to grow crops on farmland or even to recreate in some of our waterways. So really, that's kind of the main importance of our glaciers and why we continue to study them to this day, to see how climate change continues and will continue to impact these over time, to try to figure out how will this have an impact on our watershed and watersheds outside of the park. So I think at this point, we've kind of made it through the geologic story, kind of the glacier story of Glacier National Park. So I think we're ready to answer any questions you all might have.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. And again, so many people tuning into this broadcast, over 9 other classes on YouTube, 100 more students on top of that. So you've got 350 kids tuning in from across Canada, the state, and beyond. Welcome into all of you guys. If you are on YouTube or Facebook, share your questions in the chat bar. Let me know where you're joining from, and we'll take as many as we can. But I want to start with Miss Hood's class in Glen, Pennsylvania. She's been joining us for a whole bunch of programs lately. So Miss Hood, if you want to kick us off
thanks
with a
for
question,
having
come on up.
us. 2 questions, mostly revolving around living things. So the first is, has anything been found like frozen in ice before? And the second, if you could tell us a little bit about what kind of wildlife lives in your park.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in regards to things frozen in ice before, they actually are doing some ice archaeology to figure out if they can find some artifacts from some of the people in the past who have been out on this landscape. As far as I know, I haven't heard of anything super notable. I mean, of course, you're going to find like ice axes, things like that from early explorers who were up there, maybe lost a few things. I think they have been finding animal scat in the ice that they can date back and figure out how old some of that scat is. There hasn't been a ton published yet, or released on what they have been finding, but they're definitely trying to hunt down, see if they can find some more information on some of the wildlife that may have been here in the past, as well as the people that may have been here in the past.
Yeah.
And then in regards to the wildlife species that we have here, we have a huge abundance of animals. We have nearly 70 different mammals. Kind of the big highlights for most people are things like our moose, grizzly bears, black bears. We have mountain goats and bighorn sheep. Of course, fox and deer animals you're going to find in other places too. Wolves are another cool one. And then one I think is pretty cool is wolverines. They're not often seen in the park, but high up in the mountains, the snowy places in the mountains, sometimes people will see wolverines in Glacier.
Awesome. We actually did a presentation on wolverines, I think 6 months or so ago, and it was really cool. So some great stuff. I'll try and find that for all our teachers that are joining in. Great question, Ms. Hood. All right, I'm going to go to Ms. Basalto in Miami in just a minute, but I want to take this question because it's really quick from Jacob in Spruce Grove in Ms. Holden's class. So Jacob's wondering if you can skate on a glacier, Stephanie. What do you think?
Skate on a glacier. That would be tricky, especially the glaciers we have in the park right now. A lot of our glaciers are actually up on the sides of mountains, so they're going to be at a pretty nasty, steep angle. So if you're skating on it, you'd likely slide off of them. Also for glaciers, they don't tend to be very smooth ice. A lot of them are going to be pretty bumpy depending on how they're moving over rock and other material. And we also do see a lot of crevasses in glaciers, basically places where the flow has changed. So there's big gaps and cracks. So there's a good chance if you are in a glacier, you could run into a crevasse and potentially fall in one. So I wouldn't recommend skating on a glacier. It sounds fun, but I think it would be pretty difficult here.
It's possible, but it might be the last thing you ever get a chance to do. So there you go. So there's your answer, Jacob. Thanks for the question, man. All right, Ms. Basalto's class, come on in. And if you have a question for us from your students, go for it.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for having us today. We're having a great time.
Awesome.
Yes, my class has a question is, what is the effect of microplastics on glaciers?
Interesting.
That's a very good question. I haven't seen much research or heard much about microplastics necessarily impacting our glaciers here in the park. Especially since we sit at the tops of the watersheds and our glaciers are kind of at the top, they're lucky that they're not getting additional microplastics dumped into them. A lot of our glaciers are in places where people can't easily access them. So a lot of like easy ways people could get little bits and pieces of plastic and other debris is not super easy for those to get transported into our glaciers. That being said, other places, if glaciers are kind of sitting downstream or in more populated areas, I'm sure that would have a decent impact. And kind of probably the biggest impact it would have if it does get into the glaciers is when they melt out and then that water gets washed into waterways. You're dumping a lot of that into different water bodies, and then the different animals and people would get impacts.
Yeah, that is a good answer for that. Miss Basalto, way to go, keeping our theme from September going into October with microplastics. We're glad you're still on board. What I want to do now is go to Miss Durnan's class in Clinton, Ontario. If you guys have a question for us, come on up.
Hi, thank you for having us. Our class's question is, how many researchers are on your Glacier team?
Ooh, that's a great question. You know, off the top of my head, I don't know the number of people. It really varies. So you're going to see a few more people come in the summertime, and they'll maybe just be here a few months. And then you'll only have a few people on the staff in the winter itself. We just see big fluctuations in our staffing levels throughout the seasons. I'd say there's at least a handful specifically for USGS, the United States Geologic Survey, that are specifically tasked with doing glacial research. And then you're going to get researchers coming in from kind of different other parts of USGS or even the National Park Service kind of joining them on some of their research projects. But I don't know offhand quite how many, but definitely I'd say a handful of glacial scientists. I can think of at least like 3 that are here year round.
Okay. Great question, guys. Thanks for asking about researchers. We really appreciate that. All right, I want to go to Highland Park Junior School. So Miss Bradbury's class in Halifax. If you guys want to demute your mic, I'll bring you into the broadcast and you can ask your question for us. Hey, yes, Halifax, welcome in. Go for it, guys.
And the microphone's there. I have a question. You can bring him back. Do we really need polar bears because they're like the only animal that actually are like are out to kill humans? Do you think we really need them?
Do we need polar bears? That's a good question. I mean, we don't have polar bears here in Glacier National Park, but polar bears do play a role in the habitats they live. They play a role of kind of being that top predator to making sure that they manage the other species that they eat below them. So if you're losing that top predator, you tend to see a lot of those other species that they eat, their populations get really large, and then they might eat themselves out of the food that they eat, and then you start to see those populations die off. So just to have them as kind of species control for other species is really beneficial. So I would definitely say that polar bears play an important role in the ecosystem that they live in.
And they're just lovely and inherently worth protecting. We had a session earlier today with a polar bear guard on the Mosaic expedition, so you should check that out. And incidentally, if you think polar bears are the only animals that eat people, I encourage you to go check out tigers or other large bear species or some sharks or crocodilians who might disagree with you. I want to take a question on YouTube. Let's go to Miss Cheryl's class in Montana right nearby. And the question is, how cold does it get in Glacier Park during the winter?
Ooh, great question. So it really varies. This past winter when I was here, it was pretty warm. We were averaging like high 20s, low to mid 30s for most of the winter. The winter prior, when I was down at lower elevations in the park, we had at least a week and a half where we were probably negative 25 with the wind chill for a solid week. When you get up in those high mountain areas, you're looking at super blustery temperatures well into the negatives. With the wind chills, and then in some places you can even get over 100 mile per hour winds. So it can get very cold depending where you are in the park. Average, if you're in these low valleys, especially on the western side, I'd say you're looking like teens to 20s for most of the winter.
Yeah, nice question, guys. All right, let's go to the Bernstein family in Mount Auburn, Wisconsin. Welcome in, kids. If you guys have a question for us, go for it.
Yeah, how big is the biggest glacier in Glacier National Park?
Yeah.
Ooh, great question. That is Harrison Glacier. And hold on a second. I'm going to get my little booklet that tells me the size of all our glaciers because it's hard to remember off the top of my head. It is very large, if I remember. Let me find it here. Harrison Glacier is about 410 acres. So you can imagine 25 acres is the smallest a glacier. It's the smallest a glacier can be. It's 410 acres. So it is a large glacier.
Yeah. I'm so glad you guys asked that question too. We've been getting it a whole bunch on YouTube as well, so that's awesome. What I'm going to do now is go to Miss Kump's class in Astoria, New York. Again, they've been joining us for a ton lately. And then I'm going to take a bunch of YouTube questions. We'll see how many we can take, and we'll see if we can take a few more from our live classes. But Miss Kump's group, come on in. Take us away.
All right, some of our students are a little bit shy to ask today, but one of them wanted to know, how are icebergs and glaciers related to each other?
Nice.
So icebergs and glaciers, I think a lot of times when you think of like icebergs and glaciers, a lot of times it's when you're thinking of kind of those coastal glaciers, when you're in those kind of oceans, those huge bodies of water. And a lot of times those icebergs are kind of getting calved off or kind of broken off from a glacier itself. Here in the park, you're not necessarily going to see a ton of like icebergs with our glaciers because a lot of our glaciers, since they sit on mountainsides, they're not connected to bodies of water. Some of them, they'll have like meltwater ponds, and sometimes you may see chunks of the ice calve off and fall in there. But I'd say icebergs itself are kind of more connected to those coastal glaciers. Unfortunately, what we don't have here in the park.
Cool question, guys. I think that's the first time we've ever got that question. It's neat. Thanks, guys. All right, let's take a few YouTube questions. So Miss Reed's class, I love this question. Where in the world are glaciers mostly found, Stephanie?
Ooh, so where in the world are glaciers mostly found? They're going to be high up in mountains and kind of cooler areas. So when you're looking at like Glacier National Park, we have a number of glaciers. If you go over to like the state of Washington, there's a national park called North Cascades. They also have a lot of glaciers. Even going south into the chain of Rocky Mountains into like Colorado, there's glaciers. So it really has to do with kind of those higher elevation, cooler places that are still going to get a pretty solid winter. At least enough snow to try to maintain some of that glacial ice. You're going to find it kind of across Europe as well in some of those cooler, high alpine, high altitude locations.
Yeah, I want to highlight for our students, National Geographic magazine had a beautiful feature recently on glaciers in Asia and the Himalayas and the water bodies that they help feed. So all the major rivers of Asia providing water to billions of people. So there's a really cool article. I'll try and find a link to it while we're chatting for the rest of the session. And if not, I'll share it with you guys in an email at the end. Let's go to Leduc, Alberta. Cadence in Miss Lavoie's class wants to know how much snow and ice is on a glacier on average, if you can quantify that, Stephanie.
Ooh, that's going to really vary. You know, you're going to have enough that maintains it. That's a great question. But all of these glaciers are going to really vary on how much snow and ice they're going to have. So like we mentioned Harrison Glacier, it's about, 410 acres in size, at least 100 feet deep. So you got to at least have that 100-foot depth of ice and snow to consider it a glacier. But you're going to see a lot more for most of our glaciers. I unfortunately can't spout a number out since it varies so much. But it's going to be more than 100 feet. So a lot, at least in depth.
Yeah. Very cool. I would encourage all our classes, especially some of our older classes, to look up North America and how much the ice sheet covered it for a huge portion of the last 20, 50,000 years. So it's like a mile plus of ice. Like it's a ridiculous amount of ice that covered where I am in Toronto, other places in Canada and the northern United States. It's quite incredible to sort of highlight the history of the forces that shaped our landscape. So check that out when you're done as well. I'm going to take one more YouTube question and we'll go back to our live classes. So Leighton in Miss Holden's class wants to know how clean the water on a glacier is. Could you drink it straight from the glacier or do you have to filter it first or what's going on?
Very good question. So our water from the glaciers, is coming directly from the glacier. So it is really clean. It's going to look really clean. But a thing to keep in mind with any water even coming from glaciers or coming from any of our waterways is the park is the animals' bathroom. So the animals go to the bathroom anywhere in the park. Any of that can get washed or onto the glaciers. It could get washed into the waterways. So we tell people no matter where they are in the park, they should always filter their water before they drink it. So that's going to be like a pump filter or like an iodine tablet. You always want to purify that water before you drink it because you just don't know if any animal waste has gotten in. And the bacteria that comes from animal waste is called Giardia that basically really upsets your stomach. So you definitely always want to purify that water.
Yeah. And if that message is true for glacier water, which people sort of think of as the cleanest this can be, that applies to water all over the world. So wherever you happen to be adventuring, try and bring something to filter your water or use it from municipal systems that filter that for you. Let's go back to Miss Hood's class. Let's see if we can get another round of questions. Maybe we can. Miss Hood's group, come on in.
Hi again. I have a question from my student Amelia. She's wondering, and I'm kind of guessing the answer based on what you were just saying about the drinking water. She was wondering if people are allowed to camp at Glacier National Park.
Oh, absolutely. So we have lots of different campgrounds across the park. We also have a lot of campgrounds in our back country that people can get permits to hike out to, carry their tents out to, and stay at. So we do have lots of camping opportunities. Our thing here in the park is you just always have to either have a reservation at our campground or at one of those backcountry sites to stay. You can't just go off and wander and stay somewhere in the park, and that's solely because of the bears. We make sure that all of our approved campgrounds, they have places for you to hang up your food or store your food to keep it away from bears.
Yeah. And that's something that's not just true in Montana. That's true in a lot of Ontario provincial and national parks. Pretty much wherever our students are joining from today, there'll be those sort of precautions in place. And that's what the park system is for, to make it safe, accessible, and easy for people to go and camp. So check it out. It's a great way to explore the world, especially during COVID-19. All right, let's go back to Ms. Basalto's group, back to Miami. If you guys have another question for us, just demute your microphone and you're good to go. I'll let you know when you're in. You do need to demute your mic, Miss Basalto.
Yes.
There we go. Perfect.
Hold on, one at a time. Yes. Emily? The microphone is...
Oh, it wants to work. It's thinking about it. Miss Basalto, I can come back. If Emily's sharing a question, we'll come back in just a minute and you can take it in the meantime and I'll come right back. Okay? Perfect. Let's go back to Ms. Durnan's group. If you guys have a question for us, go for it.
In your opinion, what is the greatest negative impact of shrinking glaciers?
Ooh,
That's a really good question.
really good question.
I'd say the most important for like the actual impact of the glaciers disappearing is just the water component of it. So when our glaciers disappear and we're going to see this big loss of the ice and that snow, it means not only are our waterways going to lose an amount of water, they're also going to get warmer because they're providing that really cold temperature to our water. Once we see those temperatures go up, there's a few species in the park who are really temperature dependent. Some of our fish species, as well as some of our aquatic invertebrates. If that water gets too hot, we're going to lose some of those aquatic invertebrates. Things like our meltwater stonefly, that actually feeds a lot of fish. If that disappears, some of our fish might lose food. If those fish can't survive and find food, they're going to disappear and they're food for other animals. So I'd say the temperature and the quantity of water coming from the glaciers is probably going to be one of the biggest negative impacts when we start to really see the reduction in the amount of water as well as the rise in the temperature.
Yeah. And this is true for glaciers. It's true for a lot of the other effects of climate change that we're going to be seeing over the next 50, 100 years. And even now is that humans are ultimately reliant on ecosystems to provide them with water, food, air, etc. And climate change is going to radically, in some cases, impact those ecosystem services. So it sort of behooves our classes and anyone who's tuning in to do action to help mitigate that climate change effect, because it is going to be a serious issue for a lot of people. From some of our groups joining us today, you're seeing this with fires, droughts, major storms already. And so the glaciers is sort of a delayed effect, but it's one that we're going to be increasingly worried about in the coming decades. So I'm really glad we got that question. Thanks to our student, Ms. Durnan's class. All right, we'll go back to Ms. Basalto. If you want to demute your mic again, you're good to go and share Emily's question with us. Hey, Ms. Basalto, yep, you're good to go whenever you're ready. Here you go.
Yes, we have some questions here for the from my class. What is the food tree for the glacier environment? And how has anybody ever tried climbing the mountains?
Yeah.
Ooh, what was the first part of that question?
Yeah, could you repeat the first part?
What is the food tree for the glacier environment? So this is Emily.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So you're kind of thinking like the food web itself for our ecosystem. So you're kind of starting out kind of on a lot of the plants we have in the park. And then you're moving up. So a lot of our herbivores are going to be eating the different grasses, the different wildflowers, different bushes. And then those herbivores, things like our deer, are really good food for wolves, for mountain lions, for the bears. Once you get kind of up into that level with the bears, the mountain lions, animals like that, you're not going to be seeing much that's impacting those animals. Mostly it's going to be humans that are impacting those animals, kind of those top predators. So that's kind of more like the terrestrial or the land-based kind of food web. For some of our other aquatic animals, it's going to kind of start with some of those insects. So those aquatic insects, they're going to be eating some of the algae, some of the other kind of plant materials in the waterways. And then they're going to just be going up from fish to fish to fish. And then eventually things like bears, other animals might be consuming them. And then
do people climb the mountains there?
Oh, do people climb the mountains? Absolutely. I was actually trying to climb a mountain last weekend. So people definitely do climb our mountains out here in the park. The thing with our mountains, they're really tricky to climb. There's no trails to the summits. So you have to know how you're getting up there. There tend to be a lot of shrubs and bushes, a lot of cliffs, and our rock is not very stable. It crumbles really easily. So a lot of times if you're walking and trying to climb up a ledge, it might crumble underneath your hand or foot. So you definitely have to be really prepared to climb it and have the right equipment because it can be really tricky to get to the peaks.
So not quite as dangerous as skating on the glacier or fighting a polar bear in hand-to-hand combat, but still something where you want to be very prepared. Awesome. All right, let's do again. We've got time for 3 more quick questions. So I'm going to go to Halifax first, to Highland Park Junior School, if you guys want to come and do a question. Then I'm going to go to Wisconsin and New York. So Halifax, come on up, you mute your mic, and you're good to go.
Hi. How long does it take on average to melt a glacier?
How long does it take to melt a glacier? So that's going to really vary depending on winter conditions and summer conditions. So sometimes you may see, if you get a really, really hot summer and you've had a really sad winter before that where you didn't get a lot of snow, you're going to see a glacier lose a lot of ice and a lot of snow. But if that next winter you get a lot of snow that gets back on the ice and maybe you have a cool summer, it could actually, maybe not shrink as quickly, or it could maybe even gain some size. So really dependent on the weather conditions and how much snow you're getting, how much snow you're seeing lost every year, will really kind of fluctuate the the melting of a glacier.
Yep. Awesome, guys. All right, let's go back to Wisconsin. The Bernstein family, if you guys have another question, go for it.
We both have a question, actually. Mine is, what do you recommend as the most fun thing to do at Glacier?
And what's your favorite glacier?
Ooh, favorite glacier and most fun thing. Great questions, guys.
Okay. Let's see. The most fun thing to do here in the park, I love to backpack. So I love to go and hike out into the mountains and carry my tent with me and sleep out at our approved backcountry sites. I just think that's super fun. It's a great way to get to places where most people don't get to see. Let's see, my favorite glacier, it's probably the one I've been to the most. I really like Sperry Glacier. I've probably been to that glacier 3 or 4 times. So I think that's one of my favorite. It has a really cool area that it's shaped out in a basin it sits in. That's beautiful. So I'd say that's probably one of my favorite glaciers.
Outstanding. Well, we'll wrap up with one last question from Miss Combs Group. If you guys want to wrap us up, go for it. Hey, New York.
Hello.
Hi.
My question is, can you go swimming in the melted glacier water?
Ooh.
You absolutely can, but there's 2 things to keep in mind. A lot of times where that glacier is melting, that water is going to, since the glacier has been there before and carved it out, it tends to be pretty deep. So be prepared to suddenly drop into deep water. And then secondly, that water is freezing. It is so, so cold. So if you're prepared to get in cold water and deep water, absolutely, it's great to swim in it. If you don't like cold water, I would not recommend getting in that water. It's very cold.
Fantastic, guys. Really great questions today from all our classes. Please, if you have more, send them along to me via email, jesse@exploringbytheseat.com. I'll pass them on to Stephanie. More questions that we can possibly answer in one session. But what we want to do at the end of the broadcast is bring all our live groups in. So Miss Basalto, Miss Hood, Miss Durnan, Miss Bradbury, Miss Kump, if you want to join me in saying a big thank you to Stephanie for joining us today. You're all on screen. Go for it. Thank you so much, guys. All right. Have a wonderful rest of the day.